Hello students, this is Dr. Yu. Welcome to part 2 of online presenting, live contexts, and synchronous presentations. In the previous video lecture, part 1, you learned asynchronous context. Now, there's a lot of overlap between asynchronous and synchronous presenting. So it's not like as if all of the principles are different, but it's just that because there are some contextual differences, some principles don't apply in the same way in asynchronous as they do in synchronous. So if you did not watch the asynchronous video lecture, you're going to still want to watch that because there's still principles in asynchronous presenting that can still apply here. Now going back to types of online, just for those of you just joining us, remember that there's different types of online presenting. Remember that there's synchronous, and synchronous means that it's presented live in front of an audience where you have video and chat feedback, and then you have to make a decision, are you going to show your face or not show your face? And that's what the focus of this lecture is today, is on showing a synchronous online presentation with your face. The first lecture was about asynchronous no face presentations, and that's what you learned in part 1. Now we're focusing on part 2. There are 3 things you're going to learn in this part of the lecture series. You're going to learn some software specifically for synchronous presenting. This is going to be different than screen recording software that you learned in part 1. Then you're going to learn some presentation tips unique to synchronous presentations. And then lastly, we're going to talk about audience engagement techniques again, because you're doing them online, not only do you get the benefit of doing live audience engagement techniques, but then there are some new ways that you can do regular audience engagement techniques that you probably couldn't as easily do in a face-to-face setting. Now let's focus on the first part, which is virtual meeting software for synchronous presenting. There's a lot of software out there for virtual meetings. One that you could use is Google Meet. This is different than Google Hangouts. Google Hangouts is more one-on-one, maybe 1 to 4 people. Google Meet is actually for running virtual meetings online. And all you do is you just join or start a meeting with the meeting code, and then you can basically do a lot of things. You can call the meeting something, give it a name, if you will. And then you have like the microphone feature, you have all these nice little features that a typical meeting software has, and then you can mute your voice, and then you have the ability to do a screen share, which is what a lot of presenters do, and all that. So Google Meet is definitely an option. I think it's for the most part free if you're a member of Google Suite, and that's just one that you don't have to download any software for, which is really nice. If you need another option, there is Zoom. Now, Zoom has different plans and pricing, of course, but Zoom I really do like. It's very user-friendly and very sleek, and Zoom is very common among enterprise. I know in Toastmasters we use Zoom for all of our virtual meetings, so I'm a big fan of Zoom as well. And Zoom has a lot of features, so this is your typical Zoom window. You have mute, start video, share screen, you can manage participants, and there's a chat feature, and you can also record. You can record Zoom interactions, and then you can see the chat here, and they have all these nice little things on the bottom that make Zoom meetings really easy to work with. But there's even more software out there, and I can show screenshot after screenshot of software, but just to make you aware of other things, a lot of professional speakers and corporate trainers use Adobe Connect. You have to have the Adobe suite, obviously, to use it, but very high-powered webinar software that you can use. There's also WebEx. I know like my university uses a lot of WebEx. I'm not a huge fan of WebEx, but it's there. There's also GoToMeeting and JoinMe. So just find a software that you really like. Some of this might come down to what your company uses, so it may not even be your choice what you get to use. But if I had to recommend, if you had an if you were open-ended, I would go with Zoom or Google Meet. Now, we're going to next look at some presentation tips for synchronous presenting. Now, some of the tips do also apply to asynchronous presenting, but there are some ones that are unique to synchronous. One that's common to both is clean your screen. Please clean your screen. Like I said, I mean, you don't want to have icons. You don't want to have a messy screen where people are being distracted by what's on it. But even more so, when you're giving a synchronous presentation, there might be a time when somebody might ask you a question and you might have to impromptu look up something. And this has actually happened once. I was in a Zoom meeting that was live and somebody asked the presenter a question. And the presenter was like, oh, well, let me go to my browser and like look up the answer. And he went on his browser in front of everybody with the screen share on. And then like when he was typing in his like request, in the URL thing, some search results came up, like past search history. And so we have to see his past search history from the past week while he was typing. If you end up in that situation where people ask you to do something and you're not sure if like you want to show like your entire browser and such, either unshare your screen for a second, just let them know, hey, I'm going to unshare my screen while I look this up, or just go ahead and do it on a separate window or device and then do the answer. But if you don't want to show people things, just clean your screen. The other thing you can do, you can launch private mode on your browser if you're going to use your browser, or you just launch a separate desktop that is clean, and then you don't have to worry about all those things. The next tip is know your tools. Webinar software and video meeting software, like I said, it varies. There's so many different ones out there, and you have to know what your software allows you to do. And when you know your tools and you know how to use them, you can be a very effective presenter. One example is Zoom. So with Zoom, you learn what all the buttons are. And like one thing you have to tell people is to mute their mics, because sometimes when you're presenting, if everyone has their mic on, like any background noise, somebody's dog's barking, it's going to interrupt your presentation. Then you can also see, like, you have to know how to share your screen. Learn to use the chat feature. Some people might ask you questions in the chat box, for example. And so you have to know how to access your chats and look at your private messages. And then just know all the things that go on in a Zoom meeting and being able to see your participants list over here and all of those things. So make sure you become really familiar with your software before you start using it. I always do test runs. I try to find some people to do a test run with if I have to use a new software and I have to present, just so I know where all the buttons are. And so I know how to do something when I need to do it. The other thing about Zoom too is Zoom, you can put people into breakout sessions and you can do sub Zoom rooms basically. So let's say there's a group of 10. I can break you up into groups of 5 and then have you meet back in the main group of 10 at a later time. So learning how to do breakout rooms and breakout sessions and all those things are really important to be an effective meeting facilitator online and a presenter live. The third thing for synchronous presenting is managing your stage. Because chances are, if you're going to be doing synchronous presenting, you're going to be showing your face. And you have to make sure that, number one, that your background is taken care of. You might have seen this video before.
Camels happen all the time. The question is, how do you monitor those camels? And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just brought in. I mean, shifting sands in the region, do you think relations with the North may change? I would be surprised if they do.
Yeah. So you don't want to be that guy. I mean, you feel bad for him because he has kids at home and all that stuff. And I would show more of the video, but I don't want to get YouTube copyrighted, infringement and all that stuff. So definitely you have to make sure you control your environment, your background, your dogs, your kids. You have to make sure all those things, because it is kind of cute actually that he has these kids, but then it kind of, you can tell he's quite embarrassed by it. So control your background, make sure you're in a good room. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is you want to show your face and look good. Now, the background is one thing, like making sure it's not distracting, making sure you don't have a messy room, or like it's your bed, or like, your favorite Britney Spears poster in the background and all those things. But then there's another aspect, which is your actual face. Now, there's a nice YouTube video, and I have it on mute right now because I can't show the whole thing. Once again, I'm worried about copyright and all that, but I have a link there at the bottom if you see it right here, and I'll make sure to include the link in the comments too. This is a really good video on how to look good in Skype interviews, but he talks about all of the camera aspects to make sure you have good sound, good lighting, good background, all of those things. So definitely check out this video and you'll learn a lot about lighting and effects and all those things, and angles too, to make sure you look your best when you're presenting on your face. Now, in summary, you want to make sure you know your tools. You want to make sure you clean your screen. You want to manage your stage. And you want to show your face and look good. Those are probably the 4 big things that I would say when you're giving a synchronous presentation. On top of having a good PowerPoint, make sure that you have good slides, make sure that you have good vocalics, make sure that you're marking up and being interactive as you can. If you do all of those things, you're going to have a good time presenting online. Now that we've talked about software and presentation tips, let's talk about synchronous audience engagement techniques. Now, the nice thing is a lot of the audience engagement techniques that you are doing face-to-face transfer pretty well with synchronous presenting. But then there are some added things that you can do with some of the face-to-face audience engagement techniques that you can use in an online context that you can do additional things with. So let's do the challenge again, synchronous audience engagement. Let's think of how you can use the following AETs in a synchronous presentation: imagination exercises, reflection, discussions, polls, audience recitation, and think, pair, square, share. So just take a moment and think, how would I use these audience engagement techniques in a synchronous presentation? So I'll go ahead and give you 10 seconds to think about it. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, let's look at some of the possible audience engagement techniques in a synchronous presentation. Well, first, you can definitely do close your eyes and imagine and reflection exercises in an audience that is synchronous with what you're presenting. So just tell them, close your eyes and imagine such and such, or reflect upon a time when you had to blah, blah, blah. In either case, what's nice is you get to see their reaction. You get to see them close their eyes. You get to have that immediate discussion afterwards where they can share their answers. So that makes it pretty easy. You can always do these techniques, regardless if you're doing synchronous or asynchronous presenting. What about discussions, though? I know discussions are ones that, you can definitely see obvious ways of doing it. Well, of course, you can just do it face-to-face, and you can have people just share what they're going to say through the camera, and you can have that kind of interaction with your audience just immediately because everything is synchronous. But another option you have for doing discussions, if people don't necessarily want to talk through the camera, if you're doing a webinar type setting, you can also have people do it in the chat. So you just use the little chat feature, and people might write to you in the chat and say particular things, and that'll get a discussion going. And in fact, while you present, people might be chatting and discussing what you're presenting without interrupting you, which is pretty nice. What about polls? I know polls are going to be interesting because you can probably think people can raise their hands, but what are some other options? Well, of course, you can just do show of hands, or, how many of you have X, Y, and Z? And if you've asked people to mute their mics, when you've asked people to mute their mics, they might not be able to say something, but if you get them to raise their hands, you might be able to see it that way. But it just depends on what your software allows you to see. Some presentation software only allows you to see 6 or 7 people at a time. But yes, you can totally just do it the normal way and maybe ask people to unmute their mics for a second so you can get a response. Another option is you can do it through the chat, like type in Y if you've done X, and then everybody can just type in a letter, in terms of yes or no, okay? Or just write me in the chat. And then that's a more orderly way where people don't have to unmute their mics, but you can still get a response, and then people are interacting with you that way. So in a way, when you're presenting online and you have a chat feature available, you can leverage that chat feature to allow you to still present, but then still have ways for people to asynchronously or synchronously interact with you, and then you can go back to that chat and use it for things. But a third option as well is you can do live polling. So have a live polling software ready, and then just ask people to click on a link or to go on this website, and then you just do a live poll. And you can do the same thing that you did in asynchronous presentation. You could have a Google form that that's ready to be filled out. Give people time to fill out the Google form, and then talk about the results during the presentation. And maybe let people see the results. And then you can say, I see that most of you filled it out like this. The other thing you can do is you can have people take the Google form before the presentation and then talk about the results during the presentation. So if this is a planned presentation, days, weeks, months ahead of time, you can just say, hey, I'd like you to fill out this form. I'll talk about the results when I present. And then there you go. What about audience recitation? Well, that's pretty easy. When you have a face-to-face synchronous presentation, just an online synchronous presentation, you can just have people fill in the blanks for you. Now, again, people's mics might be muted. So the thing is, you'll have to cue people to unmute their mics. So you just have to keep that in mind. But if people's mics aren't muted, what must come up must come, and then everyone can say it. Or you can have people type it too. So there's a lot of ways you can play with that for sure. And then lastly, think, pair, square, share. So how might you do a think, pair, square, share online? Well, it's great when you use great online presentation software. Because number one, you can just have people, depending on the size of the group that you're talking to, you could have people think, pair, square, share just together if it's a small group. Or you can have people do it through the chat feature as well. Or you can also have people do it in breakout sessions on Zoom. So a Zoom breakout session would be a room within a room. And then when you have people do the breakout session, and you can see this is it right here on this, you can have people think to themselves, and then you can have them pair in a breakout session and square in a breakout session, or have them pair through chat and then square in a breakout session and then share back in the regular session. So there's a lot of ways you can leverage breakout sessions to allow people to have private chats face to face, and then just bring everyone back, and then you've done all 4 phases of the think, pair, square, share. Now, today we talked about software for synchronous presenting, which is mostly going to be your online meeting software. Then we talked about presentation tips, and a lot of the tips from asynchronous apply, but then some other things come into play as well. Manage your environment, look good, show your face, all those things. And then lastly, we saw that you can still do audience engagement techniques in a synchronous presentation. And not only that, there are some added ways you can do some of these techniques, like breakout sessions, polls, and all those things. So synchronous presenting does offer you a lot to play with. Now, synchronous and asynchronous presenting is important because it may be the future of public speaking for a lot of contexts, and you may end up giving more online presentations than anything else. As the world becomes more remote, as pandemics occur and we do these quarantining type things. But the power of online presenting is I'm able to speak on YouTube to potentially millions or thousands or however many people through online presenting. And so use this ability to present online to speak to the world, because face to face, you can only talk to the people who are in the room. Now, if it's being recorded and then it gets posted, okay, fair enough. But for the most part, face to face, you're very limited to physical space. But online presenting, there is no physical space. There's just you, your content, your software, your presentation tools, and your audience engagement techniques. So go speak to the world and make a difference.